and stick to our schedule because our afternoon is going to be very full, which is good news as far as we go, because of all the people we invited were able to come, sometimes from very far away, to celebrate this exceptional anniversary, that is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This afternoon, we chose to give the floor to 12 figures that are fully committed to fighting for human rights. They come from all continents, and because of their personal history, because of the variety of what they've done, they impersonate the variety of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. So I would like to thank them very warmly for coming here and for accepting our invitation. The Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jean-Yves Le Drian, will join us later on this afternoon and will speak at 5:30 to give his vision of France's policy in human rights. I would like to start by introducing myself. I'm François Croquette, the Ambassador for Human Rights, and it is my great responsibility to make human rights be a lively topic internationally. And to introduce this afternoon, it seemed to us important, since we are in Europe, to give the floor first to the person who is the face and the voice of human rights in Europe. That is Mrs. Dunja Mijatovic, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, whom I'm going to give the floor to right now. Let me remind you that the Council of Europe is an organization of 47 countries, which is larger than the European Union, and it is an essential institution in the international system for protecting human rights. That's why we're so happy that Mrs. Dunja Mijatovic accepted our invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Croquette. Thank you, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France, for inviting me. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it is a profound honor for me to be here today to speak on this symbolic day, very important day for all of us, as we mark the 17th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it is even more important that we mark it here in the very city where the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed this milestone international agreement, the one we have to praise, to honor, and also to recommit ourselves to the values and fundamental freedoms, now more than ever before. The Declaration proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. What a wonderful words on paper for so many states and so many countries. So what I would like to see as Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe is more action, more implementation of these wonderful words on paper. This very principle of our universal equality, along with the affirmation of the inseparable entitlement of all people at all times and in all places, has inspired and transformed the lives of millions of people and continues to give hope to countless more, and we should never lose hope. But for all the progress of the past 70 years, we are still a long way to go. We see rapidly evolving restrictions of freedom of speech and assembly, with journalists, human rights defenders, and academics killed and imprisoned, and civil society organizations smeared and prosecuted. I was so glad just a few minutes ago to see my friend Tcherkassov from Russian Federation, who is traveling around and fighting for human rights defenders and also for his friend, courageous human rights defender from Russian Federation, Oyub Titiev, who sits still in prison as we speak. For many people, it is extremely important that these words on paper become practice and become something that is part of their life. But unfortunately, this is not a case in too many states. For too many continue to face marginalization of violence because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, or because they are disabled or old. Asylum seekers trying to find a safe haven in Europe are turned away, left without rescue, or beaten up, or sometimes killed. Our societies are breeding divisive levels of inequality, fear, and polarization, moving us away from equality, freedom, and dignity for all. We must do better, much better, for the rights of the single mother living in poverty, for the disabled child unable to attend a mainstream school, for the families who struggle to make ends meet even when they juggle 2 jobs, for the women and girls who are sexually harassed, beaten, for the young persons afraid of being put in immigration detention because she lacks documents, for the recent graduate who faces discrimination in the labor market because of his name resonates or his families who lack recognition because of the sexual orientation of their members. I believe the founding principles and values of the Universal Declaration are as relevant today as they were when they emerged from bloodshed, tyranny, and war. This requires that governments recommit, as I said at the beginning, but not just the government, societies, each and every one of us, to the values and principles of the Universal Declaration and become stronger advocates of human rights. We need to find a way how to better communicate about the importance of human rights for each and every of us, how to better communicate about the importance of human rights, not to take it for granted continuously and to present ourselves as living in a bubble. As we speak and we cherish this extremely important document tonight and today, it is also extremely important that we know that in different parts of the world there are people suffering, not being able to enjoy the protection of this extremely important document. At the same time, human rights are not only a matter for state authorities. We, as elected officials, public personalities, or simply as citizens, must stand up for the values that underpin human rights. We must act every day, bring the values of equality, respect, diversity, and inclusiveness back to their rightful place in a political discussion. If we team up, if we join our forces, if we join our voices and engage with public at large, we can maybe achieve this, but we should never give up. This is why I see today's event, your presence here, and the exhibition created by the cooperation between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Cartooning for Peace, and my office as a step in the right direction. Promoting and supporting Cartooning for Peace is an honor for me and my team. And we will try to show how important it is to show that the visual art, the cartoons, can sometimes send even better message than the words. It can touch the heart of a person that cannot understand a language. It can touch the heart of a person that simply doesn't know how to read. So the visual art, cartoons, and this kind of free expression is extremely important, as Cartooning for Peace are constantly saying, for peace and for security of our societies. But at the same time, as promoting freedom of expression, as showing that we need free speech, we need to also accept images and words that are not the words and images we like. We need to accept something that is provocative, that is also making us think twice about certain issues in the society. This is just one of the reasons I decided to have this very important cooperation and also the exhibition that will travel after Paris to Strasbourg and probably to many more cities. Giving practical effect to the vision of hope, freedom, and universalism conveyed by the Universal Declaration is possible, but only if we all stand up for human rights, which this day is showing that we are willing to do. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Commissaire. Votre présence.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. Your words are those that we expected to open up this afternoon session of discussion. And I think you know that France will take over the presidency of the Council of Europe in 2019, and you will be working together on human rights within the Council of Europe. The exhibition shown in the rooms that you walked across to come here are the first concrete expression of our efforts with Cartooning for Peace, and I would like to pay tribute to them here officially, and to Plantu, who was kind enough to join us this afternoon. I'm very happy that this exhibition can be shown in such a location, a prestigious location as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's a good way of showing our common plea. I would like to ask now Mr. Philippe Sands and Mrs. Sandrine Treiner to join us up here. Would you kindly come up here?
Vous avez des micros qui sont prévus également. Philippe Sands, vous êtes avocat franco-britannique.
Philippe Sands, you're a French and British lawyer, and you specialize in human rights matters and matters of international criminal law. Sandrine Treiner, you are the director of France Culture since 2015. And a few weeks ago, you initiated a conversation on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, on its history, its genesis, and its current applicability. Let me remind you all that the declaration was adopted 70 years ago, right after World War II. It's a very short text. It only has 30 articles, and they're very clear and straightforward. But of course, it dates back to then. It's 70 years old. So it talks about the freedom of expression, but not about the internet. It doesn't talk about the Paris Agreement for the environment. And we would like to invite you to reinterpret the declaration and starting to think about the founding moment, which was the Nuremberg trial and the adoption in the third session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Philippe Sands, in your beautiful book, Return to l'Amérique, the Genesis and the Main Principles, you seem to be confronted on a daily basis to the difficulties in implementing human rights. France Culture last night broadcast a retransmission of your reading of the book, and France Culture is dedicating several talk shows today on the situation of human rights all over the world. I would like to ask you how you understand its inheritance of the Nuremberg trial and how you reinterpret the Declaration of 1948 and how we can all remain true to the universality of the Declaration. And we understand that globalization has made things a lot more trickier. You have the floor. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, François. Thank you, François Croquette, for thinking of inviting Philippe Sands, and I'm very happy to have a dialogue with him at the beginning of this afternoon. At France Culture Radio, we ask an actress to read all the articles of the declaration, and everybody can listen to those articles all day, all afternoon on the radio. Why? Because we are not educating people enough. we are at a period where it's important to give explanations. We've got to go back to the initial reasons for that declaration, which are very simple. And we're going to have a little flashback, because I don't think that we can have a bright future if we don't know where we come from. François Croquette reminded us of the fact that this declaration has got 30 articles for this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the preamble, you have this sentence, this is an ideal, a common ideal to be achieved by all people. And this is an ideal which goes back to the 18th century, to Rousseau, to the Contrat social, and which was speeded up by the plight of the Second World War. François Croquette mentioned it, I'm not going to repeat it, and your book, Return to Lemberg, which has been quoted, is a fundamental text for people who want to read a very good book, but also for those who want to understand what happened in Nuremberg, what was at stake in terms of the establishment of a supranational law, that is a law which could be applied to everybody in the world. So we can only ask simple questions, and I'm going to start with one for you, Philippe Sands, and i.e., what does this declaration take from the proclamation of Nuremberg? Well, first of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Croquette. It's indeed fantastic to have all these people in the room, but also it's important to have young people here because I'm a professor at University of London, and for me it's very important to see all these young people and all these people from different origin, and they are leading us into the future. What happened in 1848 was completely revolutionary. Before 1945, the situation was very simple. The state had absolute power in terms of international law. If the state wanted to say that on this side of this room everybody was going to die, international law would remain silent. What changed, and it actually started in 1945, what changed was that it was the idea that any individual has rights, not only in domestic law, but in also international law. And it's been the first time in history that an individual could say after 1948, I have rights at the international level. Before, individuals couldn't say so. And the two words which were used for the first time on the 20th of November 1940 at the Nuremberg trial was crime against humankind, protection of the individual, and genocide, that is protection of peoples. And 3 years later in Paris, we had a repetition of somehow the Nuremberg principle in Palais de Chaillot, which was the signature of the human rights of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so that was a revolutionary moment. Well, on the eve of the 10th of December, i.e. the 9th of November 1948, the Convention for the Prevention and Repression of Genocide was also established. Why? Why does it happen at the same moment? Is there a link between the declaration and the convention? As a lawyer, could you tell us the difference between a statement, a declaration, and a convention? Yes, there is a link between the two. While the United States, France, the UK, and the Soviet Union were negotiating the Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, they introduced for the first time the idea that any individual has at any time the right to be protected. That's the expression crime against humankind. And at the same time, a professor in Cambridge and also René Cassin in Paris talked about genocide. And genocide is the protection of not individual per se, but protection of individuals as part of a group which has the right to be protected. For instance, today you have somebody, a woman from Yazidi, from Iraq, a Yazidi person from Iraq, and who is playing a very important role. In the Nuremberg ruling, the crime against humankind has played a role, but the ruling was silent. And the inventor of this word, who coined this word, came and said, I want a resolution which says that genocide is a crime under international law. And 2 years later, the convention that he supported was signed here in Paris. So the difference between a declaration and a convention is binding in international law. A declaration has no legal certainty, and we had to wait 20 years, 1966, to have a convention on the protection of human rights in Europe, and a binding, therefore, instrument. So you see the difference between a convention and a declaration. Well, the first event, the first fact of this universal declaration is the declaration itself, the text. Now, the second important character is the word universal, which is used because it shows that the declaration is something completely new. Yes, let's take a step back. In the summer 1945, a book was published by a big lawyer, English lawyer, from a Polish origin, the International Bill of the Rights of Man. And it's the first text that talks about this revolutionary idea, and this happened with the adoption in 1945 of the United Nations Charter. And the idea by René Cassin is very simple. Every human being has minimum rights under international law, because we are all in this room individuals, men, women, black people, yellow people, heterosexuals, homosexuals. Everybody has a minimum amount of rights under international law because of our very nature of human beings. Because before there was a convention for the protection of minorities, which was stating that some minorities had rights, but not all minorities. What is different in that declaration and convention is that everybody in any and under any situation has the freedom of speech, this freedom of reunion, the right to life, the right to be protected against torture. This is a completely sweeping, it's revolutionary. But the fact that in 1966 there are 2 international pacts which are signed, the Pact for Economic and Social Rights and the Pact for Human Rights, including cultural rights. What does it mean? Does it mean that when in 1948 the declaration is adopted, it hasn't got the means to be implemented? And so what happened in 1966 what happens is that the human rights have the possibility of being implemented thanks to the role of the international community. Well, yes, but it's a bit more complex than that, because the 1948 declaration had no binding force, but it was reflecting customary or common law principles. So the problem which was raised by the author of the convention, I mean, the Convention Against Genocide, these authors were saying, we are going to proceed at different levels. We've got the level of domestic law, and each country has its own ways and means to set up rules to protect humankind at the national level. Then we can have regional law. In 1950, there is a regional convention for the protection of human rights, and we heard the representative of the Council of Europe say how it worked. And then you have conventions in Africa, in America, not yet in Asia. And then at the higher level, you've got international convention. But what connects all these conventions and declaration is the idea of universal nature of these rights, because any human being, he or she, has minimum rights, and this is revolutionary under international law. And of course it takes time to implement all these rights, and of course it remains a real problem. The implementation is a true problem. But don't you think that we should also understand that we talk about law, we talk about rights, but we do not talk about values? So how would you connect the values, the human rights values, and the rights? Well, this is, I can explain this very simply. I'm a lawyer, I'm a barrister, English barrister. You know, the guy who's got a wig, still do, you know, when I go to the international court, I wear this wig. I'm half French, half English, but my English part loves wearing the wig. And so I'm, I talked to the judges at the International Court, and I said, here are the values, there are the values I'm using. And I have no reaction, no response. Why? Because for them, the only important thing is law, is rights, I need a piece of paper saying convention signed by states. And if we transfer the values into conventional right, conventional law, which means that, there is a negotiation and approval, then there is a transformation of values into a piece of law or a right. And if I just use values, I've got no clout. But if I use a paper called treaty, convention, and legislation, then everything changes. Where I understand, so you've got rights, which gives you the possibility of, having a bit more clout and to have a wig, to wear a wig, which is a lot. And but of course, the next question is, what are the remedies against the non-implementation of these rights and the execution of these rights? Well, there are many possibilities. First of all, we can take action before our national bodies. But there are problems, because in many countries, judges are not independent. So therefore, you've got to go to another level. There is a regional level. In Europe, we have in Strasbourg the European Court of Human Rights that plays a key role for the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. And if we go to Africa, there is an inter-African court, and there is also an inter-American court. But the problem is that they haven't got the same clout as a national court. They adopt a ruling, but then it's up to the state to decide whether that ruling is going to be executed or not, or implemented or not. In many states, they are implemented, but in many other states, they are not. So you have, for instance, the Convention, 1966 Convention Against Genocide and Against Torture, and we are negotiating for the first time in 70 years. We are trying to bridge a gap, making sure that with all these conventions we can, create bodies which make sure that these conventions are implemented. Now, in 1945, in parallel with human rights, the world created this idea of a criminal court, criminal international law. In Yugoslavia, the Court for Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court. But as you know, not all countries are parties to these conventions. For instance, China, Russia, the US are not party to the International Criminal Court. So it is not a universal court. Well, so what about today? We'll introduce the speeches by people who are going to talk about their experience. I mean, is there any step back, regression in terms of human rights? Everybody says yes, but I mean, this one observation is that there is no universality of human rights. What do you think? Well, today it's quite clear that we are going through a very dangerous moment. There are many problems. As we say in English, there's a backlash against human rights. And very often I'm asked whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic as far as human rights are concerned. I would say that it all depends on, the timeline. I'm rather pessimistic for what's going to happen tomorrow and in 10 years' time. For the longer term, I'm more optimistic. As I say to my students in France and in the UK or in America, it's a long game. When I was a student at Cambridge, I had a teacher or professor, and then we became colleagues, that I appreciate very much. He asked me at the time, what are you working on? And I was working on an issue, a problem in international law. And he answered, yes, I understand. I mean, we had the same problem in the UK in the 15th century. It took us 250 years to solve that problem. I think that international law, human rights, are a bit like this. It's a long game. We've got to look at things in the long term. At lunch, I talked to those magnificent people that you're going to listen to this afternoon, and they all describe fantastic and terrible personal experiences, and it's impossible to feel optimistic, but we've got to go back to 70 years ago. 70 years ago, in 1933, 1939, even in 1945, these pieces of papers didn't exist. There was no convention, human rights, protection of the individual, and in protection of groups. We could have lunch, as we did today, but there was at the time no protection. Now there is a protection in terms of rights, even if those rights are not implemented as they should. But we know that we are on the right side of history. The trajectory is going into the right direction, i.e. the direction of the protection of individuals and groups. But in the few years to come, the situation is going to be very difficult. A last question. François Croquette was saying earlier on that we should look at this declaration as though it was adopted today. But if we re-adopted it today, do you think we ought to change the concepts contained in them? Are there arguments which would be more efficient today? Well, as far as the implementation is concerned, perhaps, but let's go back to the contents first. 5 years ago, I was the member of a governmental commission in the UK. It's a commission on the Bill of Rights. The idea was to draft a new international and domestic text on human rights. So we were 8 lawyers, and the idea was to redraft or to draft the European conventions for that. After 2 years of work, we were not capable of improving what had been done or was done in 1950. So I think it would be the same thing for the Universal Declaration. As François Croquette said, we have other problems, the internet, social media, who are subject to these rules. We've got the environmental issues, and actually, I personally would add another right, the right to a safe environment. But, apart from that, the declaration really touch upon the whole of the activities of humankind. But one thing is the application, and another one also is the interpretation of human rights, the balance between the private right and the right to do something in a group, and the ability to act without harming the other. All this is very complex, but the big principles were laid down in 1948. There were maybe a few changes, maybe a few added, complementary ideas, but the text remained excellent. Well, I hope that your optimism is going to materialize. Thank you very much for coming to Paris to speak to us today, and I advise everybody to read this important book, Return to Limburg. Thank you, Sandrine. Thank you very much, Sandrine Treiner and Philippe Sands, about this dialogue on the declaration at a moment where civil liberties are at stake. Now, I would like to ask the next panelists to talk about the problems in implementing the Universal Declaration of Humankind. So I would like to ask Michel Forst to come. He's the rapporteur, the special rapporteur in the United Nations on the situation of defenders of human rights, and Mr. Karim Abdel Radi, who is a lawyer and photojournalist, and Mr. Alexandre Tcherkassov, who is a journalist and who has been fighting against impunity and fighting for memory. Michel Forst, you're probably going to say that that date is also the anniversary of a text by the United Nations, and I would like to ask you what changed in 20 years' time for these people who are acting day in and day out in the field to defend the principles of the 1948 declaration. And I would like to tell Mr. Radi that the journalist Shawkan was tried by and sentenced by the Egyptian court And I would like, you to tell us what's happening. What is the situation of a photojournalist like Shawkan, and why do we think that he's a defender of human rights? And Mr. Tcherkassov has been working on the Gulag, and so people always remember what happened, and he's been working against impunity, and you are a bit harassed by the Russian administration who say that you are a foreign agent, and a few of your colleagues are suffering the same case. I would like you to describe to us the way you can manage to work in such a difficult environment. So, Michel Forst, you've got the floor. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, François. François Croquette is asking us to do something really very difficult, i.e. in 9 minutes he's asking us to describe the situation of human rights defenders in the world, and I therefore are going to go through big chapters which show the obstacles and the threat that they are faced with in the world, and to show how difficult it is and their situation is that I'm going to give a report on 140 countries, starting from Albania, going through Zimbabwe. France will be also the subject of this report that I'm going to give to the United Nations in a few days' time. So we celebrate both the Universal Declaration, but also this text for in favor of human rights defenders. And today, it's very unlikely that this text be adopted by all the countries on the planet. And this text gives a definition of who are the human rights defenders. And it says that any individual who ensures the protection of human rights is a defender. You do not need to be a member of a body to be able to be deemed a human rights defender. And in the remit that I have, I get a request from whistleblowers, from diplomats, sometimes from prison guards. I mean, a big range of men and women who, in their daily life, take action to defend and to protect human rights. And sometimes the threat, are really very dangerous. The first one is political murder, but political assassination. Between 2015 and 17, more than 1,000 journalists have been murdered in the world because they were trying to protect and defend human rights. And the perpetrators of these killings are not only the security agents like the police or sometimes the army, but there are more and more civilians. And it's more and more difficult actually to make investigations and to work on these situations. And perpetrators of these assassinations as well are international companies, especially from the north, in mining, for instance, and they are really murdering directly or indirectly defenders, human rights defenders. In a big number of countries, you have a decline of the number of homicide in the population, but at the same time there is a significant increase of the number of assassination of human rights defenders. This paradox is a problem. How can we put an end to this? And physical attacks against or assault against defenders are rife. There is physical threat or direct assault, there is kidnapping and missing defenders. This is on the increase. And there was also another phenomenon, which is impunity. it is quite striking to see that impunity increases in the world in spite of an increase in transparency in Central America. And we have rate of impunity of 95 to 98%, which means that out of 100 defenders assassinated, we've got 5 investigations and only 2 murderers who go to court, and of course masterminds are never taken to court. There are campaigns in European unions, for instance, a campaign of defamation, of smear campaign. They are called, foreign agents. When you've got actually men and women who daily, day in and day out, are trying to defend the values contained and enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Another phenomenon which is striking is to see the reduction of the space for civil society in terms of fight against or protection for the human rights. Sometimes, the leaders qualify the defenders as enemies of the country, of fighting progress, and we can see this diminishing of civil society space. And there is, for instance, the restriction to, cuts in the budget, the obligation for defenders to register their associations, and all this is imposed by the states. And there's also a change of the law on foreign agents in Russia, and this change in the law is then emulated in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, in Poland. Another striking phenomenon, and we're going to talk about this, is the restriction to travel. Your passport is impounded. The more and more defenders who want to go to Geneva at the United Nations or New York in the United Nations are arrested. Their passport is taken away from them and they cannot travel. And this happens and also to the members of their family. A fifth phenomenon, which is quite striking in this report, is the number of countries who increase the number of laws enabling to criminalize the activities of the defenders. And so it's easier and easier to bring defenders to court. There are also security laws, especially under the cover of fighting terrorism. And these are obstacles for the activities of defenders. Sometimes defenders are brought to court for really trivial reasons. It's quite clear that the idea is to curtail the activities. And then there's the increasing phenomenon of surveillance. There are more and more sophisticated ways of surveilling people, surveilling their mails, their calls, and in many countries, this electronic surveillance is massive, including in our countries. And we are not today free to communicate without being recorded or listened to. And the safety or the security bodies record our mails and use them. Another phenomenon is the lack of cooperation with the United Nations. Fewer and fewer countries accept to cooperate with the United Nations. The fewer countries, accept to invite the staff of the United Nations. And some countries actually started to question the legitimacy of the United Nations in implementing human rights in the various countries. The reprisals are also increasing. A defender can go to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg or go to United Nations in Geneva, and then when he goes back to his country, he's arrested because he's accused of having given information and having shared information, and this is getting, more and more the case. And in New York, there is a mechanism which has been set in motion to try and fight this the phenomenon of reprisals against defenders.
En effet.
Just to wrap up, there is a bit of good news. We see an increasing number of states who are trying to establish effective methods to defend these defenders, to protect them. Let me give you a few examples, which I think have been quite effective. First of all, we have the EU guidelines and other states, which are instructions given to ambassadors in countries to establish mechanisms, tools, instruments that enable protection of defenders and to relocate them when they face danger. And I think we'll hear about this afternoon. We know how these relocalization measures by embassies can be very effective and very useful. Some embassies, some countries like Canada even go further than this. I spoke of threats from international businesses, international companies, and Canada is the first country to have added a specific chapter in its instructions given to ambassadors on the way Canadian companies should behave in relation to human rights protectors, defenders, and threatened populations. And I've asked the European Union to follow the Canadian example to develop similar guidelines. The second approach, which I think has been quite effective, is how increasingly embassies create connections on the ground with defenders in the regions where the defenders are. Why? Those who are most in danger are not in the capital cities. They're in the remotest areas. They're not regions that are not familiar, that capital cities aren't familiar with, that embassies are not familiar with. And so ambassadors are encouraged to go further, to travel within the countries, to the farthest reaches of the country, to meet those men and women who are the most in danger. And the last point that I wanted to stress, there are many other types of protection mechanisms, but it's also the role that national human rights institutions can play. This exists in France, but we also have Defender of the People or Ombudsman. In many countries are independent, and they can play an essential role to protect defenders. We have to ensure that in relation to the press, for example, the government, the authorities charged with pedophilia. It's very difficult to fight against the machinery of state. Human rights defenders in other countries have the same problems. The whole question of being foreign agents. Organizations are called foreign agents. I've been accused twice of being a foreign agent, both for Memorial and for Memorial International Bond, James Bond. But James Bond had very effective ways, effective tools to solve his problems. The Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, are not as effective as the tools and weapons that James Bond had. And this is a problem. You have to understand, I've been working many years on forced disappearances in the North Caucasus. Government forces of Russia use forced disappearances as their main method for fighting against terrorism, against separatism. From 3,000 to 5,000 people from Chechnya have been kidnapped and disappeared. How many court resolutions in Russia have there been on these 3,000 to 5,000 disappearances? 4. There have only been 4 court judgments. Impunity, 99.99% impunity. To punish one of these criminals, Natalie Istemirov, my colleague, worked on this question from Memorial, and the Stanislav Markelev, the advocate, the lawyer from Memorial, and another colleague, all 3 of them were killed. That's a problem. We have the Strasbourg Revolution on forced disappearances in North Caucasus. There have been more than 250 resolutions. Just this fall, we received a resolution on a few dozen disappearances. After these resolutions, the Russian justice system must continue its investigations and find the perpetrators and punish them. How much success has there been after the Strasbourg resolution? None at all, zero. Well, over the past years was meant to do something, did nothing. Only today, the Council of Europe is going to give some thought to whether it should initiate the exclusion or suspension procedure of the Russian delegation from the Council of Europe. What has been happening over these past...
The international community thereby paved the way towards the rehabilitation of the Syrian regime. Even if the regime had used chemical weapons against its own people. The international community gave its tacit agreement for the bombing of the Syrian people with explosive barrels after that the regime had signed an agreement for relinquishing and remitting its prohibited weapons. And the international community went ahead knowing that the Syrian regime still used these weapons against its people and used chemical weapons against the people after lying straightforwardly, having said that they had relinquished all arms, including chemical arms. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have seen 70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are at a key moment in history, and a very tricky one. International policies tend to push us towards cooperation, sustainable development, democratization, and good governance, but they are receding. And the UN's inability to put an end to this type of conflict this actually serves the extreme right currents and populist trends and populist talks. We hear many populist speeches, racist speeches, and xenophobic speeches. It's at that very moment that the Syrian people were abandoned to themselves and abandoned in their own fight against bombs, cannons, chemical weapons. Their houses were destroyed, and they had to flee to neighboring countries. They were forced to be displaced, sometimes in Europe, where they sought refuge to protect their own lives and their families. And this is why we need to remind ourselves time and time again. We need to remind ourselves and we need to remind others that we Syrians have not left our country because we wanted to abandon our country, but because we wanted to live freely and in full dignity. We did not leave our cities and our country because we were seeking a better fortune, but we wanted to safeguard our culture and our humanity. Those who want Syrian refugees to return home in all dignity, those people should not accept the lies they're being told by this horrendous regime. That tells them fables about reconstruction and returning home. There's no security, stability, or possibility for the people to return home if the claims of the Syrian people for freedom, dignity, the rule of law, citizenship, and equality are not met. And that will not be possible if those who perpetrated the crimes against the human people and humankind in general are not tried. As we all know, it's the Syrian regime which prevents any advancement of the Republican and democratic process in Syria. And this is a proof that goes to show that the Syrian regime cannot be part of a long-term solution. There cannot be peace without justice. And to understand this, I think we need to remind ourselves of World War II and the crimes perpetrated during World War II, as well as in Rwanda or Bosnia. Ladies and gentlemen, when the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights here in Paris on December the 10th, 1948, the world was just coming out of World War II. Horrendous crimes were perpetrated in the Nazi concentration camps. And the world wanted to say in unison that it was high time that there be a universal conscience based on common values. That's what the world was saying at the time, on December the 10th, 1948. That's what the world was saying, that never again would the world accept such violences and such crimes. And that freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of religion would never again be quashed. And that never again would crimes of torture, forced disappearance, arbitrary detention be accepted. War crimes, crimes against humanity, would no longer be accepted either. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry to have to say that this quote-unquote never again has fallen by the wayside. And this weighs heavily on the conscience of humankind. I'm sorry to have to say that this never again will be called Syria forever, as long as justice has not been brought, and as long as the victims of said crime have not obtained reparation, and as long as the world remains divided, and as long as war criminals and those who perpetrated crimes against humankind and against the Syrian people, as long as these criminals remain free, when the Syrian people are jailed in large prisons, there will be no equality. Our fight for freedom and for justice is the fight and the responsibility of the whole humankind. And to make sure that the future of humankind is not like the Syria of Assad, father and son, we want to make sure that Syria's rights of freedom and humanity are respected. Thank you.
Vous pouvez rester avec nous. Merci, Monsieur Türk, pour votre témoignage.
Thank you, Mr. Turk, for your testimony. You did not want to mention the ordeal you went through when you were imprisoned for many years in an underground cell of 2 square meters. You have been nicknamed the Syrian Mandela, and you are today living under the protection of France, and we're very proud of it. Mr. Mantilla, we would like to touch upon the situation in Venezuela, another situation which is crucial for the international community. You were elected MP in Venezuela, but had to leave your country. Could you tell us more about your experience? Good afternoon to all of you. It's important, Ambassador, well, it seems to me that the time has come to extend my thanks to you and President Macron for protecting me and offering me asylum in France. France has reminded us of the fact that Venezuela is not so far from France that we think. In this room, there is also a representative from Nicaragua, another country that is going through the same thing as Venezuela today. And a country which is seeing the problems Venezuela is faced with for many years as a result of the dictatorship. And this representative is here with us today. "20 years ago, Venezuela entered a process of retrocessing their human rights, because 20 years ago there was a dictatorship in Venezuela, a military government linked to drug trafficking. The family of the person who is in the presidential palace today is jailed in the US, so it's difficult to talk about politics and human rights with somebody who does not go by the rules. In 2014, a group of young people, and I was part of them, went out on the streets to say that Venezuela was a country in which there were persecutions, people were killed, that was lacking medication. And following this demonstration, many of us were jailed. Others were killed by Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship. Today, Leopoldo López, the leader of Derecho Popular is jailed or under house arrest. He has an electronic bracelet that he has to wear for the simple reason that he is a dissenter. I was jailed when I represented no danger for the country, but I was just the first young person to defend LGBT rights, the rights of the LGBT community. And because the dictatorship wanted to, they imprisoned me for 2 years in an underground cell with no air, no light, and no sanitary measure. For 2.5 years, I did not see the light of day. I was accused of war crimes. I was separated from my family, my friends. I had no contact or no freedom for 2.5 years. And during that time, I understood that torture is the best possible minister of Maduro's dictatorship, because all the people who were jailed in 2014, I think there were 600 of us, we were all tortured. And if you will allow me, I will explain how torture works in Venezuela. They are hanged from the ceiling to force or to get forced declaration from them. Young people are raped with all sorts of objects. They are plastic bags with human dejections are placed on their heads. That happens every day in Venezuela. And today, there are more than 300 young Venezuelans who have been jailed because we just want freedom. This is not a problem that is linked to the right or to the left in politics. It's just a humanitarian problem. It's not a fight of parties. It's just the fight of a young generation against the ruling drug trafficking government. The government said it was the right that was against them, but no, we are 30 million Venezuelans who are suffering hunger and persecution. Not so long ago, the United Nations said that the Venezuelan exodus counted more than 7 million people on the road, the largest to this day after Syria. Between 2014 and today, the Venezuelan people lost 14 kilos. Every individual lost, on average, 14 kilos. The only way for us in Venezuela to get food was through a special car that is delivered by the government. And fake elections were held to elect the local authorities, and the people had to vote on 3 elements. They had to register. Everybody had to register to vote, and then they got a chicken that fed a whole family for a month. It's very difficult to understand that Venezuela is not so far from where we are here in Europe. And very often people don't even know what is going on in Europe. But Venezuelans like myself in exile are working on it. In the next few months, there will be more and more Venezuelans who will arrive in Europe. And the same thing will happen in Nicaragua. There will be more and more victims of persecutions and violations of human rights who will be in exile. I'm very concerned and I'm very worried about what is going on in my country, but I'm also very worried about the lack of understanding and awareness that there is abroad about what is going on. There's a large part of our population in exile abroad, and the International Criminal Court has just initiated proceedings against Venezuela. But one needs to know what happened in Venezuela for the past 20 years, what has happened regarding human rights. There is no way of finding a way out of this situation through elections because the government controls every single thing. Even the judicial power is in the hands of the government. There is a Venezuelan judge, the first one who tried to oppose the dictatorial regime and to follow the rule of law. She made a decision which was unprecedented, and she was imprisoned after that. She was raped, and she was almost burnt alive. Since she was pregnant, she was forced to get an abortion in jail, and after this case of the Venezuelan judge, nobody dared oppose the regime of Maduro. There are more than 300 political prisoners in Venezuela who were tortured in a very cruel way on a daily. And this is similar to what Africans suffered and what Europeans suffered in the past. But this is what is happening in Venezuela, a country that has only had 40 years of democracy and then went back to a dictatorship. We depend on what the international community can do for us. Countries such as France, which have supported us for 20 or so years, were essential. It was very difficult to explain the situation in Venezuela to foreigners. I think oil managed and the petrodollars managed to buy everybody aboard. There's no oil left in Venezuela and no dollars. There's only hunger and despair. So now I think it is the right time to pay attention to human rights in Venezuela.
Merci pour votre témoignage.
Thank you very much for this testimonial. It's important to talk about torture today. And this is something that is unlike what might think is becoming more common in the world. And I think we need a lot of courage to talk about it so openly. Now, I would like to give the floor to a representative of another generation of people in exile who arrived in France in '89, who's a French citizen today. Mr. Chongguo has been working for human rights in France. I would like to ask you how you have carried on your work and your commitment to human rights. Thank you very much.
Ouais, en fait, j'ai voulu parler de...
I wanted to talk about life in exile. I spent 20 years in France now. I've spent 20 years in France since 2009. I'm a French citizen today. And I found a French name. So my name is Laurent in French. Once I was given a French passport and a French name, I managed to come over from Hong Kong to France, and I must say, I cried. And it's been 9 years now, and in 9 years that I'm proud of what I've done, even prouder than what I did in '89 in Tiananmen. Because what we managed is with a friend of mine, Han Dongfang, a comrade of mine, a colleague of mine. He is the only trade unionist who's created or set up an association in China. And he's a director of the Association of Trade Union, and I'm the deputy director. So we work together. When we arrived in Hong Kong, we decided to start working again together. We work with all sorts of Chinese NGOs, activists, workers, to promote a dialogue and collective negotiation. Our slogan, our motto is win-win. Even three, win-win-win. So everybody's a winner. All sides are winning. we create a spirit or a spirit of trade unionism, but not, which is not partisan. We just encourage our fellow workers and our fellow citizens to develop this spirit. If they are arrested by the police, we tell them what the association conveys to them. And it's the only way to develop our activity. It's impossible in Hong Kong to keep things secret. Everybody we did was totally transparent. The first week we held a meeting, and the very next week the Chinese police were aware of what was said in secret in a room in Hong Kong. So it's best to work in full transparency. Until 2015, until 3 years ago in December, we managed to create an NGO and a network with Chinese workers and with Skype and all of the online systems and techniques for communication. We managed to work with workers and workers on strike. And the idea is to work together with workers who want to go on strike to draft a document or a set of claims, and we work with them to decide jointly when to stop the strike. We conducted 20 or so training sessions to try and train Chinese workers to trade unionism. Now anybody can come to Hong Kong with a special authorization from the police station. So workers used to come to Hong Kong to follow a training session on trade unionism and on collective negotiation. It's not a workers' movement like Solidarnosc in Poland. No, Solidarnosc wanted to create a real union, whereas what we've done in China is different. Repression is much stronger. Repression is much harsher, so we avoid to create unions, hard unions. We try and pave the way or prepare things for collective negotiation. Through collective negotiation, workers or employees can elect their representatives. So starting from there, we've managed to create a feeling of solidarity. We managed to create a social link between workers, and workers can start learning how to elect their own representatives, how to negotiate with authorities, what kind of language to use with their employers. So the idea is to sow the seeds of some kind of civilian society. These activists, these workers, work with NGOs and also with NGOs that work for the protection of the environment, and other NGOs who work for defending homosexual rights, all sorts of NGOs. But I must say that I'm still optimistic. I'm still optimistic. I can't help it. It's because I always bet on human capabilities. I think that I've been lucky enough to live in exile and to develop my second identity. And I've learned a hell of a lot. I never thought beforehand everything that I would be able to discover and learn. I work with many trade unions in France, Force Ouvrière, CGT, and all of this is immensely useful for me, for my work in Hong Kong. I've set up all sorts of training modules, and I've been broadcast over the air on the radio, discussing with workers. And I've tried and share with them all that I've learned in France. But now we're faced with a new situation. Since 2015, many activist workers and NGO representatives have been arrested or have disappeared. Even if I'm optimistic and everybody is optimistic in China, the official ideology has changed radically. The first step was in the 50s or 60s. The official ideology was we are socialists, everything is jointly owned, the land, the means of production, etc. And in France and in the US, they said that that was a formal democracy, but in China, we had a real democracy. And then in China, they started saying they needed time to implement or make a real democracy come true. And since the Olympic Games, the official positioning is that China is stronger and that our regime is the best, that democracy is an Occidental or Western value, but now the Chinese regime is the impersonation of the future. That's why Mr. Xi Jinping wants a Chinese, or to provide a Chinese solution to world problems, because we, the Chinese, say that our regime is more effective and that human rights is a bit of a fantasy. So this, of course, forces us to think about things and to discuss them. Many people have rebelled against this new ideology. Activists, workers, NGOs started organizing themselves again, but with a different strategy. Because it's important to see the bright side of things. Of course, our new ideology is a bit fascist, but how could I put it? Well, the framework of the Chinese propaganda is based on a nationalist ideology. And all of the Marxist part of it has winded down, and the regime has been weakened by all of this. So I think this gives us an opportunity to push things further. So that's why I said that sometimes we need to be optimistic. Thank you.
Merci, cher Laurent, pour cette.
Thank you, dear Laurent, for being so optimistic and in such a bleak period. Thank you very much, you three, to have talked about what happens in exile. And please do go back to your seats in the room.
Nous approchons donc.
So, Minister is going to come quite soon. I am aware that we have already have you listened quite a lot, and we wanted to now do something a bit different, i.e. to talk about the protection of journalists. When we imagine what we could do, I imagine a dialogue between two very demanding journalists. Plantu, of course, we know the cartoonist, but we do not know very well the activist for peace. And we also have Mr. Christophe Deloire from Reporters Sans Frontières, an association which fight for the protection of journalists in the world. Do come on stage. Thank you.
Alors avant de...
Before asking Plantu and Christophe Deloire to show their proposal as to the solutions to defend journalists and the freedom of the press. We know that Plantu does cartoons, cartooning for peace, and Christophe Deloire makes proposals within Reporters Sans Frontières, with a proposal which was adopted in the Forum of the Peace in Paris. I also wanted to give you a selection of 3 very short videos, and they come from the Mobile Film Festival. Mr. Smadja is here with us, and I thought that he might sort of say a few words on these videos so that the award ceremony took place last week, and he's going to say a few words on this. Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. It's a great honor to be here with you today. So I created that event 14 years ago. It's based on a very easy principle: 1 mobile, 1 film, 1 minute. And so we invited, people with, thanks to a partnership with the United Nations and YouTube. And so we got, many films from many countries. We selected 51 films, and they have already been seen by 21 million people. And all these films defend the human rights. And we are going to, show this in Kabul. Our films and videos were broadcast in Brazil, and I would like to thank the Quai d'Orsay and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's is really help us with its network in the world, and we discovered new talents, and we're trying to, grant them a number of some money so that they can make those films. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and I'm very happy to show you my films. Thank you.
Dunja. Monsieur Mendy, Abdoulaye, vous m'écoutez? Regardez-moi. Bon, hier, ils ont refusé l'asile à un couple de Guinéens et en plus, la femme était enceinte. Donc, on va laisser tomber tout ce qui est vos histoires de menaces de mort au sein de votre famille. Et on va parler que de persécution politique. D'accord? Répétez après moi, la persécution...
Politique.
Voilà, vous êtes prêts. Attendez, non, il manque quelque chose. Vous avez un chapelet?
Non, madame, pourquoi?
Mettez ça. Abdoulaye, il faut que la juge voit que vous êtes de confession chrétienne. Donc mettez-le de façon bien visible, apparente. On peut y aller. Qu'est-ce que vous tenez à la main?
Ça, c'est la déclaration des droits de l'homme. Je me suis dit que j'allais lire ça devant la juge. Je connais bien les trois premiers articles par cœur.
Non, mais ça, Abdoulaye, ça n'a aucune valeur juridique. On n'est pas là pour improviser. Vous voulez l'asile politique ou pas?
Oui, madame.
Allez.
Merci à Bruno Smadja.
Thank you, Bruno Smadja and his teams. These films were shot thanks to a mobile phone, and so it was said it can be our worst enemy, but the mobile phone can be also our best friend. Jean-Christophe, you have the floor.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. Until now, Mexican gangs and drug traffickers were cutting journalists into pieces. And now we realize that people who also work for the state can do this. If I should take my phone, it's because I'm going to read a few lines from the last or the latest article from Hamas Rajoudi, who was published after his death and published in the Washington Post. After looking at the map of freedoms in the world, which was really very somber, especially where he used to live. And he wrote, the people who live in these countries are either misinformed or not informed, and they are not in a position to debate publicly or talk about the conditions in their daily life. The public opinion, which is under the influence of the state rhetoric, is completely locked in lies, and the situation is probably not going to change. And then in the article, a bit later, he wrote, my dear friend, the eminent Saudi writer wrote the most famous article ever published in the Saudi press, but he is now in prison for his comments on the Saudi establishment. The newspaper As Mahroum has been put under the control of the government, and this is not criticized by the international community. Sometimes it is also condemned, but after a few days, silence again. And this is what he said before he died. And of course, his death was upset the whole community, international community, but this year more journalists were killed than the previous years. So there's an increase in violence against journalists. So how can we fight against impunity? How can we protect journalists and their families? But if we do not reverse that trend, if we do not try and fight in order to impose the vision of human rights, then we will be left with reaction as an answer. So how can we inverse this trend? I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the President of the Republic to support the nomination of a special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for the protection of journalists. Because, as you know, resolutions and good resolutions have been in existence in the United Nations bodies, but they are not effective because they are not implemented. States must be compelled to abide by the obligations of international law. Today we are in a universe where for the first time democracies have delegated the mission of the state, has been delegated to other bodies. And this is terrible for democracy. We've lost the rules, as the Anglo-Saxons say. And if we cannot manage and we do not succeed in establishing rules and principle like Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on free speech, if we cannot implement those principles and values, then democracies will face deadly dangers. So how could we do? What could we do? As the ambassador was saying earlier on, we set up a commission of figureheads, Nobel Prizes, who have made statements on democracies. And since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's been other instruments adopted, but in our globalized system and world, we've got to find guarantees. We need some check and balances vis-à-vis the digital platform. We've got to help the bodies and states who work in favor of freedom are in a position to fight dictatorial states. There are also distorted competitions. There is a lack of level playing field as far as states and powers are concerned. You've got dictatorships facing democracies. So 12 heads of state and government have committed themselves to set up democratic resolutions and values on the basis of their declaration. This is only the beginning. It's only a declaration, if I may say so, at the moment, but we've been very lucky to also to have the support of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, of the United States, the United Nations, and the Director General of UNESCO. And this is very important because what is at stake is the protection of journalists and the production of journalism and the right for everybody to reliable news and information. This is a right. It's a human right, but it's also a psychological right. It's a biological right, and what is at stake is our survival. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is fascinating to hear you, and as a cartoonist and as a really bad student to school, what I can say is that when you draw, you learn a lot. And we talk to people from Reporters Sans Frontières, and I realized that citizens have access to only 12% of information because the rest is not information. And I'm realizing that we are in a democracy, so this is fantastic, but at the same time, we are dependent on marketing, the marketing of some media, some social medias, who think that marketing is more important than the editorial choice. And when you are a cartoonist, you are, on the front line. I always have felt pens, and if you look at the situation of cartoonists in countries, you can see whether this country is democratic or not democratic, because cartoonists feel changes before they happened. So this is why we are very proud to work with Reporters Sans Frontières and with our ambassador. And we're lucky and happy to work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because every time we have a cartoonist with a problem, we just get in contact with them, and we sometimes manage to solve the situation. So we like drawings and cartoons because they're a way of showing things. I was listening to Mr. Türk, and I was listening to what he went through. He was imprisoned by both Assad, and the father tell the son, everything is going to be to you. And so we can see the prisons, which are the prisons under the father and under the son. And the cartoonist is Ferzat, is called Ferzat. He's a Syrian cartoonist. I met him several times in Damas. And one day he drew Bashar al-Assad. So I said, but where are you? I called him and I said, where are you? Are you in Damas? And you are mocking Bashar al-Assad in Damas? And he says, yes, I know him a bit. Well, the next day he was arrested, and his goons just destroyed his fingers. They broke his fingers, and he started drawing again, but he's in Kuwait at the moment. And there is a singer, Syrian singers, who also created songs about Bashar al-Assad. And the goons of Bashar al-Assad have destroyed his vocal cords. Obviously, he died. So artists are in the know before everybody else about what's going on. And so I was listening to the person in charge of human rights, and I would like actually to thank Dunja, the person in charge of human rights and the Council of Europe, because you really supported us. And I was listening to the director of France Culture, and she was saying, Sandrine Treiner, she was saying, human rights is something which has to be taught, and it's true. I, go to schools with the Cartooning for Peace, the association that we created with Kofi Annan 12 years ago, and we show our cartoons and our drawings to children, and sometimes, like in Toulouse, I was in a secondary school. And it was incredible because a young guy rose his hand, and he wanted to say something, and the others said, "Well, no, he's the Jewish guy." So then I talked to the teacher. So he's a Jewish guy, and the teacher says, "No, he's not Jewish, but they don't like him." So it's true that we've got to go to Iran, to Hong Kong, to China, but here in France, we've got a lot to do. And so when, we talk to them about human rights, they react in a different way. Sometimes they're sleeping, but sometimes not. And I was in Agnières, and a young girl was lying down in the front row, and she was asleep. So I said, we are talking about human rights. So I said to them, if you don't look after human rights, if you don't protect human rights, things are going to go wrong. And so she was still asleep. And so, another girl sort of is trying to nudge her, and she wakes up. And the idea is to say, human rights is very important, because young people think that human rights is done. It's done with, because everything is all right. But you've got to tell them that it's not the case. And it's important to be able to make drawings in France. We talk about Chenchia. Well, we've got to, of course, remember that when our friends from Charlie Hebdo were murdered in 2015, there were between 100,000 and 300,000 people who demonstrated to say they are dead, it's their fault, thank God for this. So it's something that I can hear in France too sometimes. So there's a lot of work to do. We're going to try and tackle it. And when we talk about the 70th anniversary, but people understand this in another way, you know, because nothing is done for good. We've got to continue fighting because if we stop doing this, the situation is going to go really awry. So I was drawing, and I was, you know, and I was saying somebody from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came and said, well, if you want to make drawings, we've got a camera, we can film you. But it's incredible. I mean, somebody from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is prepared to film my drawings and broadcast them on television. I mean, this is marvelous. When I work, you know, I sort of watch television, I stop the image, and then I said, oh, God, I'm going to try and make a drawing. And Mr. Le Drian, Minister of Foreign Affairs, you know, is drawn here with the President of the Republic. And then, you know, we can add some symbols. For instance, here I put the flag, the French flag. And Le Drian is continuing to laugh, and sometimes says, well, Le Drian is from Brittany. Okay, so we're going to draw a lighthouse, and because after all, a lighthouse can alert people on the violation of human rights. So thanks. I've been working for Le Monde since 1972, and thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its network, I've been able to be in touch with journalists all over the world. And let's go back to Mr. Le Drian. Well, he's from Brittany. I'm going to draw a Breton hat. And what I can also, you know, put that very distinctive hat too. And so I go back to my friend who were murdered in 2015 in Charlie Hebdo. What I say is that everywhere I go, I draw. And this is why we work well with the Reporters Sans Frontières, because my friends were journalists, they were cartoonists, and they wanted to have fun. And these cartoonists never wanted to humiliate people. They just wanted to have fun, and that's part of democracy.
Ah oui, si on a un autre, moi je prends.
With a microphone, please.
Molina, qui est un dessinateur du Nicaragua. Et ce dessinateur du Nicaragua.
There's a cartoonist from Nicaragua. And we can see he warned us that the government was really tipping into dictatorship. And we knew it was not a democracy, but cartoonists know it before everybody else.
Merci à vous deux.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your action, daily action. And it's a joy to work with you. It's important for you to be supported in your activity. So now we're going to move on to the last panel. This time we're going to talk about valuation of human rights in on conflict areas, and especially we're going to talk about something really difficult, i.e. the use of sexual violence as a warfare tool. And I would like to thank Mr. Bashar and Mrs. Luseng for coming to share with us their experience. We said the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that human dignity is a priority, and it is the most fundamental value of all, which is threatened. There is a systematic violation of human rights and of that particular right, and women and also members of minorities who are suffering most from this. And it's on behalf of this value that Nadia Morad has been appointed, has been nominated. So we would like to support this action, Mrs. Bashar, because she's is defending and helping people who have suffered from rape by the ISIS, and Nadia Morad and Mrs. Julienne Lusenge, you come from the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and you have really been fighting to help women, and you are head of a NGOs, which is the Female Solidarity for Integrated Peace and Development. Please come on the rostrum.
شاغي بخير أسكلك ممنون مش وزارة فرنسا إجبر في دعوة.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the French government for this invitation. It is very important for me to be here. We are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I would like to really underline the number of genocides and crimes which have been perpetrated until now. These genocides are really very serious, and it's a question that I'm putting to people. How come nothing has been done to put an end to these genocides? Who is responsible? Politicians? Human beings? And I'm not talking only about violations against the Yazidi people, but against other peoples everywhere in the world. There's been there is this Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted 70 years ago, but unfortunately violations against human rights continue. And as an activist today, I can say that I've spent 1.5 years in Daesh prisons. I went through a very difficult experience. I tried several times to flee, but I didn't manage. And I tried to flee so as to be able to scream and shout what happened in this part of the world, and to tell what women and girls, Yazidi women and girls, are going through. And I decided to defend my people and to inform people of what we went through. We mustn't forget this. To date, we have 3,500 men and women still in prisons, in Daesh prisons. There are members of my family. I haven't had any news. I haven't heard anything from my family for the last 4 years. Many women were sold and resold during these years. Girls as young as 8-year-olds. they were kidnapped from their school, and then they were taken away and raped. These children were taken away from their fathers and their mothers, and they were kidnapped by Daesh fighters, and we do not know why these children were taken away from their parents, but the Daesh activists and Daesh fighters wanted to make sure that they swallowed their ideology, and many people had to leave the Yazidi area and go into exile. Today, Yazidi people are massacred. Yet another massacre which has to be added to the previous one. It's only now that the world at large is hearing about Yazidi people. We saw all these thousands of Yazidi people scattered in the mountains, living under the tent with no heating, no water during winter. And these Yazidi people are prepared to live under these tents because they do not want to leave their area, the area where they were born and their parents before them were born, but also because their villages have been destroyed, so they've got no house left. I also wanted ethnic minorities and religious minorities to be protected in Iraq. They have this. They are going through the same thing as the Yazidi minority. But why have we suffered so much? It's because we are a very small Yazidi minority in Iraq, and we have undergone several massacres in that country. We need protection as surviving a Yazidi minority in Iraq, and those crimes have been committed against Yazidi people, but also against other populations. What is very important is that the perpetrators of these crimes have to be punished and have to be brought before justice, before courts. The situation is not changing very much today. The changes are really very small. And so the authors of this crime will have to be brought before international court, international criminal courts. And also we've got to fight their ideologies. I would like to say as well that we've got to protect the human rights defenders. They play a very important role in protecting human rights, and if they are not protected, they will not be able to do what they want to do. I live in Iraq, and I live here, but if I were in Iraq, I couldn't be able to speak freely. Now that I'm abroad, I can work and I can live freely, and I can work at defending and protecting human rights. Thank you.
Merci pour votre témoignage. Merci pour...
Thank you for your what you said, and thank you. You are living in Germany, and you came to Paris, and what you said is really very, very valuable for us. Mrs. Lusenge, you come from far away as well. You come from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's not easy to come to Europe. I mean, actually, it's almost impossible because in order to obtain a visa, you have to fight because there is diplomatic tension with Belgium, and the citizens from DRC cannot travel. And it has been so for months. I hope the situation is not going to go on for too long. But thank you so much for making such an effort to be able to come to Europe. You're going to talk about what happened in an area where the wartime sexual violence was particularly bad, and tell us how you think you can improve things. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Sorry, I've got a cold, so my voice is not very good, because in my country it's 38 degrees, and you can imagine I spent the whole night on the plane, but I'm coughing. I was coughing so much that I thought I wouldn't be able to express myself before you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has supported my obtaining a visa to be able to come here to this event, and it was not very easy to get a visa to come here with my husband and my son. There are lots of political tensions between the European countries and the DRC. Mr. Kabila's government indeed causes a problem, and we cannot get any visa because the Schengen house is closed down. So to put pressure on the government, no visa are allowed. Now, the question of sexual violence. We organized lots of conferences, high-level conferences, forum, workshops everywhere in the world. And the Democratic Republic of Congo has been declared the capital of rapes, and this is the consequences of the genocide in Rwanda, which caused 800,000 casualties, and in Congo we cannot count the number of deaths. The widower, the orphans, the displaced are legion. There are, at the moment I'm speaking now, children, women are strangled, are suffering sexual violence. And the international community asked the Congo government to open its doors so that the Rwanda people could come to Congo, and we allowed them to come to our country with their weapons and ammunition. And for the last 8 years, we've seen cruel sexual violence, because it's not a matter of sexual pleasure. It's a question of destroying the feminine organ. It's the dehumanization of men, the Congo's children, men and women. Women are detained and are turned into sexual slaves for months. There are roundups and razzias in villages. They come to the village, they kill everybody, they plant knives into people and to women's belly. It's exactly what's happening in my village, in my country. So I went to the Security Council 3 times to talk about these same atrocities. Every time we ask you to look at the mission of United Nations, and we've been doing this for 15 years, and you help us because it's your governments who support us. But until when? When are we going to finally remedy this suffering? When the rebels come in the villages, they come to punish, they come to humiliate, they come to make sure that population are going to leave, so that they leave their land and they can come and take over the land. We grow cocoa. It was at the moment of harvesting, a number of people invaded the villages and they drove the population away in order to take the harvest. Who are they supported by? What we say is that there are rumors. What we want is international investigation to see what's going on. Somebody from the United Nations mission said, Julienne, everywhere you go, you've got to tell them. You've got to tell them what is happening in this country is serious. Jihadists are getting organized in that forest, and it's going to be a danger for everybody. I was here in 2013, I think, and I told the French government, please help us so that what's happening in Beni stop, because it's a forest. There is uranium in that area. It's going to be a danger for the world. It's got to be stopped. But they continue. And they are building bunkers below the surface so as to be able to go from forest to forest with weapons. Only an army could help. Of course, they try, but they have lots of casualties. And sexual violence has been rife for more than 20 years. We have lost our dignity, how children are born and grow up in the midst of this atrocity. We're trying to do what we can. I told you I was a president of an organization which is called Female Solidarity for Integrated Peace and Development. We are providing holistic services to women, girls, and men, because men are also the victim of sexual violence. Every day we support our sisters, our daughters, our brothers victim from sexual violence. How long are we going to go on like this? We've got to work on the causes. We've got to tackle the causes, the root causes. So what are these causes? It's the war. We've got to put an end to war. We've got to make sure that war stops. France supported us in 2002 in the Ituri areas where I stayed, as a journalist for 26 years, were betrayed by armed groups. And France sent the Artemis operation. In 3 months, France make all these gangsters go away. It was a very efficient situation. Now you invest in the blue helmets from the United Nations. You've been investing in this for more than 50 years. But still, we haven't managed to succeed. How come we can't assess the situation and try to find a solution once and all? Because what did happen? You sending the money, and I said this to people. You send the money, you're sending the money, but you don't send people. You choose people who come from countries who have nothing to do with democratic values. You send people who've got nothing to do and who understand nothing about women's rights. I mean, what are these people going to do to protect women? They even become themselves the perpetrator of social violence, sexual violence. And with the money you send, that's what they do. Why can't you say, let's send a task force working on peace and who really managed to find a final solution? I went to a camp with displaced people. I met an 8-year-old girl whose arm had been cut off. Her mother was killed in front of her. And, you know, they disemboweled her, and there was the baby, and that girl saw that baby. And now she's looking after her 4 brothers and sisters, but she's got no hand. And she lives in a displaced a camp for displaced people. So what is she going to do? There's another girl. She was raped as well. She was kidnapped when she was 5. And she came back and she had a child. And she says, what am I going to do with these children? I need somebody who could help me, who could look after these children, because I cannot care for these children. There are many atrocious stories that I could tell and that we experience every day. I myself was traumatized. I worked from 2006 to 2009 on investigations with the Criminal Court, International Court investigations, ICC investigations, and I was threatened. My husband and I slept many times in the forest. My colleagues were attacked. We got machete strikes, and because of what we were doing, but we committed ourselves to do this work because we do believe that the ICC could be the body who could fight against impunity at the international level. But what was the solution? Sexual violence cases, serious crimes were not punished. And so this paved the way for armed groups to continue. So this is why today these armed groups continue. They continue raping women. They continue killing people. What we want is reassess the situation in those countries, and we've got to reevaluate the action of the peace mission in Congo. There are too many resolutions now. Please, it's enough. We need action, concrete actions, so that peace comes back. We are strong. We work. I'm working in fields. Even myself, I'm harvesting and working in farming. And in 2 months, we can produce and grow carrots, potatoes, bananas. We don't need fertilizer. Our land is fertile, but we don't have any access to our fields because they are occupied by armed groups. So help us to be able to go back to our fields. So help us putting an end to the actions of the groups, the armed groups, which are occupying our forests. We want to change that system set up by Kabila and its goons. We need democratic elections. We did our best to educate the population. We did our best to help women, to train women. We trained more than 300 women to be candidates so that they can run up against the in the next elections. We want to have these women in government. We do not want women only to butter up the other people in the government. We want women with values and women who can act. But we also want and need to be supported at the international level. We want these elections to be and to bring about change in our country. We want these elections to change the system. Our population was destroyed. We are poor now. Young people are not educated. So on television, you can see images with people running up after politicians. But why? Because they are starving. They are promised $1. They go there, and they are not even given the dollar. So please help us at your level to put an end to this suffering, which is long overdue. We would like to come here one day, tell the story of Congo, and to talk about this sexual violence and saying that it's now past. And I hope that it will happen one day. We organize victims, we train judges, we judge people in the villages. We do what we can to convey that message of lack of impunity in our villages. But please, we need help, and there are things where you can help us. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madame Bachar. Thank you, Madame Lusenge. It was really important for us to end by hearing from two women, because we often hear that the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Human Rights is about women's rights. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Europe feels very strongly about this. He'll be joining us in a moment. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd also like to say that Robert Badinter has also joined us. Minister, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Minister, dear Robert Badinter, Madam Commissioner for Human Rights, Special Rapporteur of the United Nations for Human Rights, members of Parliament, ambassadors, dear friends, defenders of human rights, dear friends, on this very day, 70 years ago, and not far from here, the United Nations gathered in General Assembly together accomplished something that was bigger than each one of them taken individually, just as this accomplishment today is bigger than each one of us. They adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This accomplishment was born out of the horror of a world conflict which, for the second time, had ravaged Europe. On behalf of all humanity, carried the hope that the aspiration to justice and freedom would triumph for all nations. It was therefore important for me that we meet today at the Quai d'Orsay to hear from those who today are defending human rights. For it is through their struggles and through their work that today we now see the spirit that predominated at the Palais de Chaillot 70 years ago today. Human rights are everything. They are not an abstraction. And I think you're very well placed to know this. The diversity of the faces I see, of your backgrounds, the commitments and the statements that we hear today show human rights are not from Paris or from New York or from the West or from some long past century. No, they are a universal demand. The principles set out in the 1948 Declaration, which owe a great deal to the inventive outlook of great legal figures from France, such as René Cassin, are the foundation upon which an essential part of human rights now rests, beginning with the two 1966 covenants and the other major conventions which have fleshed out, widened, and updated the legacy of 1948. Now, if it's important to say these things, it's because human rights are today threatened, and gravely so, and the testimony you've heard today show this. In conflict-affected countries, human rights are massively violated, from Syria to the Central African Republic, also in Yemen or in Burma. In conflict zones, the most basic rights are trampled, beginning with the right to life, liberty, and security of person that is proclaimed in Article 3 of the 1948 Declaration. And in theaters of conflict, we see today the resurgence of the whole range of war crimes, indiscriminate attacks against civilians, population displacements, denial of care, use of famine as an instrument of war, forced conscription of children, forced disappearances, systematic torture, sexual violence, summary executions, and even the use of chemical weapons. But even out of this conflict of conflicts, we hear voices that can be heard the world over that speak out to denounce barbarism, and it's these voices that we must hear today. And let me welcome Julien Luzenge, who we just heard from, who has shown such determination which merits our respect, who supports women victims of sexual violence in the context of conflict in the east of the Democratic Republic. I'd also like to thank Riad Türk for having joined us this afternoon to tell us about the ravages of this conflict in Syria. And I'm also delighted to see Lamia Haji Bashar with us today, who unrelentingly for years have denounced the crimes committed by Daesh, ISIS, against the Yazidi peoples. France fully supports you in this fight, just as we support Nadia Murad. You have already won the Sakharov Prize, and this year you received the Nobel Peace Prize, which was given to you today itself. But the growing violation of human rights do not take place only in conflict-ravaged countries. Even in the most established democracies and within the European Union, and especially as we see the rise of populist and nationalist rhetoric, today we've seen significant regressions of human rights. Insidiously, individuals are deprived of the possibility to exercise their civil and political rights. Women have difficulty exercising their sexual and reproductive rights. I'm thinking in particular of access to abortion. 20 years after the UN General Assembly Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, thousands of activists and lawyers or NGO representatives face intimidation, threats, imprisonment that nothing can justify, in line with, according to the work of Michel Forst, who has honored us with his presence here today. At least 3,500 people have been killed over the past 20 years because of their fight for human rights. Journalists who, by providing us with information, defend everyone's freedom, too often pay the price of this regression of rights. The murder in unspeakable circumstances of Jamal Khashoggi shocked the entire world. In recent years, investigative journalists have been murdered in Europe. Reporters have been threatened and attacked in Syria. Reuters journalists were heavily sentenced in Burma, and I'd like to pay tribute to Kai Chongguo, showed how far you have to fight, and even if it means taking the path to exile in order to carry out the work of journalists. These worrying trends also have a voice in international bodies and fora. We're seeing a wave of ideological challenge to human rights in the name of imperatives seen as superior, such as the sovereignty of states or cultural difference. The universality and the primacy of human rights are contested and sometimes denied. The institutions that defend them, such as the OHCHR, the Human Rights Office, or the UN Human Rights Council, are also regularly criticized. And unfortunately, it's this gloomy landscape that we face today, 70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the context for the unbending work that we must pursue. It was in Paris in 1789 that the Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen were declared, and it was in Paris that some 200 years later the Universal Declaration was adopted, and we're celebrating that anniversary here today. Since that time, France's commitment to the fight for human rights has never flagged. This commitment, our diplomatic work, carries it out on the international stage. We defend all human rights, whether civil or political, but also economic and social human rights. In 2019, we'll see a number of important dates, which will be opportunities for us to express our priorities in the area of human rights. France will take over the presidency of the G7 in 2019. It will take over the presidency of the Security Council in March. It will take over the presidency of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in May. And our campaign for a seat on the Human Rights Council will become more active. To breathe new energy into this work on the international stage, I wanted the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs to adopt a new human rights strategy, which will identify the methods and the projects that will be our priority. And these will be the main components of this future strategy that I'd like to talk about here today with you. I've identified 4 drivers through which France can carry out more effective work internationally around human rights, shoulder to shoulder with whom I call the partners of goodwill and in close ties with civil society. First of all, we should promote what I call, or what is called the international human rights law and the respect for humanitarian international law, especially in conflict situations. In all areas of international cooperation, states must respect their commitments in the area of human rights, to which they have freely given their consent. The stability and security of our system of international cooperation depends on this. Neither the evolution of relations between states nor their political choices should challenge these legally established principles. We have to remind everyone in all circumstances that violating human rights means violating law and therefore leaving oneself open to prosecution. Secondly, we have to defend our multilateral institutions, and especially those organizations specialized in the promotion of human rights. Today, as you know, multilateralism is the target of a systematic, methodical offensive, and yet only international cooperation will enable us to deal with the challenges that states face, especially in beginning with the respect for individuals' fundamental rights. During the French presidency of the G7, we will work to gather together partner countries, and there are many of them who feel that international relations should be regulated by law and not by the relationship of forces. With respect to human rights, we will pay special focus to the strengthening of collective instruments of the fight against impunity. We will continue to offer stringent but unfailing support to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and we will continue our work on making this international criminal justice system more effective, as well as on improving the mechanisms for fighting against impunity that have been created by the international community. We just heard that we should not be satisfied with resolutions. We should turn resolutions into action. Supporting international organization for promoting human rights also means, although while some are turning their backs on this, means making these institutions truly live. Since its creation, the UN Human Rights Council has contributed to improving the situation in a number of countries and has enabled the world to react to threats that human rights defenders face. And it established a peerless mechanism for peer review of human rights situation called the Universal Periodic Review. And this is why we'll continue to support with determination the work of the Human Rights Council, and we will be putting forward our candidacy for 2021-2023, just as we will continue to support the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR. Human rights must also continue to be defended at the UN Security Council. Joint initiatives will be taken with Germany, who will join the Security Council as an elected member in January, in the area of human rights and humanitarian action. Germany and France will successively preside the UN Security Council in the spring of 2019. We also have to ensure there is a demanding dialogue on human rights with our European partners, within the European Union, also within the Council of Europe, also within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, because as I said earlier, human rights are regressing everywhere, including in Europe. And today we had Dunja Mijatovic, the Human Rights Commissioner of the Council of Europe. But this is a strong symbol as we are on the eve of the French presidency of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Our third driver is our ability to use a wide range of modes of action. When it comes to human rights, we can't be satisfied with diplomacy based on posturing and rhetoric. That's easy. And yet we have a duty to act with pragmatism, because the questions that we have to deal with are often literally questions of life and death. This is why we must harness the whole range of our diplomatic tools. Sometimes international initiatives and public statements are the best way to go, but sometimes it's also in our interest. It's in the interest of those who we defend that we act discreetly. When individual cases are at play, bilateral dialogue is often the best method, because in order to be heard, you have to create a relationship of trust that allows for candid dialogue. And this is how we've pursued the case of the filmmaker Oleg Sentsov with your Russian authorities, or Taner Kilic, president of Amnesty International in Turkey. We continue to raise our concerns on individual cases with our counterparts. Sometimes I hear requests for strong public statements. And when they're not strong enough, we're told that we're not courageous. But courage, ladies and gentlemen, is to say face to face to a head of state, to tell a head of state face to face the truth, and this can often be the best way to act. Sometimes you have to do both face to face with our counterparts, and sometimes publicly. This is the case of Egypt. We have a rich dialogue with Egypt. We have the commitment that only the protection of human rights will allow for national reconciliation in that country, and the effectiveness of their struggle in the fight against terrorism. And let me welcome Karim Abdel Radi, a lawyer for a number of individuals who have defended human rights in that country. Our fourth driver is an ongoing and organized dialogue with human rights professionals. Governments don't play the same role as advocacy organizations or rights defenders. Our roles are complementary. The dialogue between the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and civil society is ongoing, and I'd like to strengthen it. To this end, the framework document, which sets out the objectives of our new strategy for human rights, which is now being finalized, it will be submitted to our partner NGOs within the framework of a coordinated consultation with the National Advisory Commission on Human Rights. And my hope is that every year the results of our work will be presented and assessed within these bodies, because we have to align our work with needs. And lastly, our human rights diplomacy must be based on increasingly on our policy of cooperation and development assistance. We intend to increase our development assistance and cooperation in 2019 in line with our European commitments, and we have just adopted an interministerial strategy, human rights and development, which seeks to establish a rights-based, integrate a rights-based approach into our cooperation development work. development programs are not only demonstrations of solidarity, but also a tool for supporting the implementation of states' international obligations around human rights. France's new strategy around human rights also sets out the priorities that we will be pursuing over the coming years. You are familiar with them, but if I may, I'd like to mention the main priorities. The first such priority is our fight for the universality of civic and political rights. We'll pursue our efforts in favor of the universal abolition of the death penalty. This is a struggle that you've waged throughout your entire life, Robert Badinter. France will remain committed in the fight against human trafficking, particularly against migrant trafficking. This is one of the scourges of our time that is ruining lives not far from European shores, and in particular in Libya. We have a duty to act. We'll also continue to work for the universal ratification of all international instruments in the fight against forced disappearances, against torture, and fighting against the impunity of criminals. Just earlier, I was talking about the importance of the International Criminal Court. I'd also like to mention the work of the Pinheiro Commission, the international impartial and independent mechanism on Syria, or the mechanism whose role is to gather and assess evidence around the crimes committed in Burma since 2011. We'll continue to work on the Security Council and in the European Union so that our range of sanctions are strengthened, and when human rights violations have a mass character. Our second priority is the security and safety of journalists. Media pluralism, the right to inform or to be informed, the ability to express critical viewpoints are essential for democratic debate. And when the life of journalists is threatened, the freedom of expression is an empty shell. France will continue its efforts to create a special position with the Secretary General of the United Nations for the protection of journalists in the world, and it will support, when it assumes the presidency of the G7, the process that was launched at the Paris Peace Forum on November 11th with the adoption of an international declaration on information in democracy in partnership with Reporters Without Borders. In 1919, we will also pursue our work around human rights in conflict zones. Human rights are part and parcel of our external operations, and in order to build societies that are resilient to crisis, to rebuild societies that have been destroyed by war, French diplomacy will promote the rights of those who will be the key players in these societies and who will consolidate peace. And as René Cassin said, there can be no peace on this planet so long as human rights are violated in any part of the world. And one of the challenges of this debate at the Security Council is the place of human rights in peacekeeping operations. You mentioned this earlier, Madam. A series of connected resolutions under the header Women, Peace and Security has allowed for the inclusion of women in the peace process, and will we use the French presidency of the G7 to prolong these efforts, prolong the efforts undertaken by Canada. Finally, France will continue to pursue its commitment in favor of the safety of rights defenders. Alexandre, Tcherkassov, and Rosmit Mantilla talked to us about the conditions in which these men and women mobilize courageously in many regions around the world. France will stand by these individuals, and we'll also be offering unconditional protection to candidates, people having the right to asylum, an obligation that is part of international law. We'll continue to defend and protect individuals who are particularly threatened or vulnerable. The Nobel Committee today itself honored the commitment of Nadia Murad and of Dani Mukwege in the fight against violence against women. With the discrimination that they face, the violence against these women is one of the most recurring forms of violation of human rights in the world. Upon my request, in March 2018, we adopted a new international strategy for France around equality between women and men, which has to do not only with official development assistance, but also France's work abroad in the broad sense of the term. The actions that have begun will be continued, especially under our presidency of the G7 and the Council of Europe, in order to make progress in a context of rising conservatism. My wish is to build an international progressive coalition in favor of the rights of women and of women's empowerment. We will take this initiative aiming to identify, to promote the promotion of legislation that is the most ambitious for the rights of women, and we will mobilize for the universalization of the Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence against Women and Domestic Violence. We will be taking this initiative within the framework of the international coalition. Generally speaking, for 2019, we will continue to promote an inclusive conception of the fight against discrimination by taking an active part in the mechanisms that fight against all forms of racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and homophobia. We will continue our commitment in favor of the defense and promotion of LGBTI individuals, with the main goal being the universal decriminalization of homosexuality. This is indispensable because, unfortunately, we still have a long way to go. Additionally, I want France to pursue its commitment in defense of victims of violent, ethnic and religious violence in the Middle East. In 2019, we will be hosting a follow-up conference of the Paris Action Plan that was initiated by my predecessor, and as the President of the Republic has announced, France will contribute to the fund for the reconstruction of Sinjar, and in the coming weeks we'll host 100 Yazidi women and their children who are victims of Daesh and who need protection here in France. Ladies and gentlemen, in a few words, I wanted to tell you about the priorities and the methods that I will be using to pursue these priorities over the coming months. Our entire network our entire diplomatic and consular network will be mobilized to pursue this strategy. Our ambassadors, who are an interface with the authorities and the society of the countries where they are located, are on the front line. Bilateral dialogue, cultural work, supporting NGOs, supporting local rights defenders. All of these are precious tools for our international action in favor of human rights. France has often been called the homeland or the motherland of human rights. This expression, which recalls that our history has often crossed paths with the history of human rights, and it honors us. But let there be no misunderstanding. Human rights are no people's, no nation's property, but rather a common good, and we are all custodians and protectors of these human rights. Therefore, it's together that we must continue to wage the fight for justice and for freedom, and this is how we will give fresh impetus to the Universal Declaration adopted at the Palais des Chaillot. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Minister, for having told us about your vision, your strategy, and the dialogue that we'll be able to have with all of you, members of civil society. This brings an end to our afternoon of presentations and hearing from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Europe. I'd like to send special greetings to the students of the René Cassin High School. We felt very strongly that they should be with us here this afternoon. I'd like to wish all of you a very nice evening. You can stick around to see the exhibit on human rights. Thank you.